When it comes to being better informed, though, in connection with leadership, our next speaker is certainly going to put us well on that path. It's my pleasure to welcome Alan Lilly. Alan is the Chief Executive Officer of Eastern Health. Alan joined Eastern Health as Chief Executive Officer in April of 2009. Alan commenced his health career as a registered psychiatric nurse in the early 1980s before completing a postgraduate education and training as a registered general nurse. He immigrated from England to Australia in 1986 and later completed a graduate diploma in health service management and a Master of Business in Health Administration. He is reflecting today on lessons on leadership. Would you please welcome Alan Lilly. Good morning, Alan.
Good morning, thank you.
You brought your own water with you?
Indeed, indeed.
You're all self-contained. You've got the clicker down there if you need it.
Excellent, thank you. Good morning, everyone. And can I just start off by saying what a great pleasure and indeed a great privilege it is to be here today, and an honour to be amongst so many professional colleagues talking about the importance and the significance of nursing leadership. And we have a huge challenge, I think, ahead of us in the health sector, and I think nurses are certainly well placed to actually lead and indeed manage that challenge. It's also great actually to be back in Brisbane because I actually gave my very first presentation professionally back in 1997, and some of you will recall the National Case Mix Conference, and Janice Secatore, who was an American Director of Nursing at the Alfred at the time in Melbourne, and indeed she was my boss, she, when I shared with her the extent to which I was actually nervous, she reminded me that most people are nervous, Alan, when they're actually public speaking, but most people fear death by mutilation next. So, you know, you really do need to keep it all in perspective. So I'd have to say her guidance certainly has helped me over the years, and it's certainly good to reflect on those moments. However, I would like to start off by acknowledging the Turrbal people of the nation on which we are meeting today, and also to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and indeed any other elders that are here today. Just very briefly, before I start, I want to talk a little bit about Eastern Health, where I'm from in Melbourne, and as you can see there, we cover a very large geographic catchment within Victoria. We are an organisation. We have 7 principal hospital sites. We have 3 emergency departments. We would see a patient once every 3.5 minutes presenting to one of our emergency departments, and we continue to treat an ageing population. And last year we treated in the eastern part of Melbourne the highest number of people over the age of 70 compared with any other metropolitan health service. We've got just over 8,500 staff and at 2,816 square kilometres with our geographic coverage. It actually makes us the largest health service in Victoria, which is funny because prior to that I came from Alfred Health, and we used to say that we were the largest health service in Victoria, and prior to that I worked at Southern Health, now Monash Health, and we used to say that we were the largest health service in Victoria. So just let me clarify for you, $1.4 billion, Monash Health is definitely the largest, 2,816 square kilometres, Eastern Health is definitely the largest, and EGO's Alfred Health is definitely the largest. And that's when people normally say, clearly Alan, you haven't worked at Melbourne Health, and that's true, I haven't. So anyway. On with the show. Today I really want to talk, as I mentioned before, about the critical challenge ahead of us, and in particular to look at the important roles that nurses need to actually undertake in the leadership space, both in terms of the policy setting, the academic setting, and also importantly the clinical setting. Nurses are indeed so well placed to actually be leading the health system, and it's interesting that when I look around the Victorian health services, and in particular the metropolitan health services, all of the people who are currently appointed to chief executive positions are either nurses or doctors, which is really interesting because I think it makes us quite unique in terms of health services, both within Australia and also across the world, but also puts us, I think, in an extremely privileged position as well. So today I want to talk about why nurses need to actually lead that challenge and that critical role that we can actually undertake, and importantly have a look at academics, have a look at what the leadership theory is telling us, and importantly also look at what practice is telling us. So I'd like to also look at, if you like, leadership in other organisations, and finally I'd like to reflect on my own career and share with you some of the things that I think are really central to being effective leaders in the health workforce today. I'd like to start off though by recognising that we do have indeed a fantastic health system in Australia. And I think sometimes it's actually hard for us to take a step back and look and reflect on just how good our health services are. Certainly on the world ranking scale, and this is data from the Commonwealth Fund published in 2015 based on 2013 data, you can see there that over on the far left, Australia actually ranks as the 4th best health system in the world. Interestingly, as you heard, I came from England originally, and I would often facetiously, I should add, say that the NHS is highly revered by everyone except those that actually use it. But clearly, those that are using it are also ranking the NHS. So not only is the NHS very, very good at packaging and, if you like, talking about its work within a very large and significant population, you can see here that on a number of dimensions, the NHS is actually the best health service or performing country in the world from these list of countries looked at by the Commonwealth Fund. So the Commonwealth Fund is a not-for-profit based in the US, and clearly they stopped when they actually found where the US rankings were at number 11. And what that actually tells you, I think, is that we can feel pretty good about the Australian healthcare system and in particular our relative standing amongst our world colleagues. But of course the challenge is, as many of you would know, that we are living longer and 20% of us will be over the age of 65 by the year 2020. So that's really fast approaching, and so I'm sure there are lots of people doing the mental arithmetic to see whether or not they fall into that 20% by the year 2020. But it is indeed a fact. Now, this is looking at life expectancy right across the world, and as you can see there, life expectancy has almost increased by 50% over the last sort of 60 years. You can see, though, that in terms of the life expectancy, Australians are in fact right up there again in terms of international rankings. So there must be something about what's happening obviously in Japan and in Spain, but of course in Spain, Andorra, Australia and a few others there are equal second in terms of overall life expectancy. So whilst we are ageing, we have universal access to healthcare, we are also living longer. And reflecting, if you like, on that previous slide, quite a contrast to what is actually happening in the US, where they are spending much more than us, but in fact their health outcomes are nowhere near as significant as ours are. So spending continues to rise, and interestingly the outlier there on the right hand side is the US. So you can see there that the US is spending almost 18% of its GDP on health, compared with Australia, which is really, with many other countries, in between sort of about 9 and 10%. And of course that continues to increase over time. But it's not surprising, of course, that the costs are actually increasing because the population is ageing, and that we know generally that people over the age of 70 are actually consuming inpatient bed days at a 30% higher rate than the rest of the general population under the age of 70. And here, just to show you how that's actually panning out, if you like, in terms of policy decisions across the states. This is Victorian spending in health, and what you can see here is that we had many fantastic years, and looking back, they did seem like fantastic years, right up there, as you can see, till 2009, 2010, and you can see there the expenditure growth up as high as 12.6%, but over those years probably averaging around 7.5%. And then you can see the challenge that is immediately with us in terms of the current growth, which is about 0.7%. And let me say to you, that's exactly how it feels on the ground. The changes that we have to make to continue to be able to live within our budgets is absolutely significant, and it continues to be particularly significant in this current financial year. But we can't continue to do the same, clearly, if we want to actually achieve a different outcome. And as Don Berwick, our international quality guru, would say, every process is perfectly designed for the outcome which it achieves. And so if we really want to make a change, we are clearly going to have to effect a different outcome, we are actually going to have to change those inputs. And you can see here the projected expenditure is really going to be up to about 25% of the GDP. It's simply unsustainable. So in terms of the nursing leadership role, I think this is really at the heart of the challenge. I think that, as I mentioned at the outset, that nurses are very, very well placed to actually bring about the changes that we need to see in healthcare. Sometimes, though, I'd have to say, I feel that as nurses, we are indeed our own worst enemies. And sometimes we allow people to actually put nursing down, and sometimes we put nursing down ourselves. And I think one of our greatest challenges is to actually really celebrate the significant importance of the work of nurses, so that people actually understand the professional contributions that we make both individually and also collectively. I'd just be interested, by way of a show of hands, how many people here, hands on heart, would say that they would be happy to recommend nursing as a career to their children or to their relatives? So, probably not surprisingly, I'd say definitely, I think the majority in this room, and probably there's a bias there, isn't there, in the sample in terms of people who are here at the Australian College of Nursing Conference. But I think the reality is that there are so many poor perceptions about nursing that I think that is something that we need to work very hard to really change within our community, because we know at the same time that nurses are indeed extremely trusted from a community perspective. It's interesting, I started my career as a psychiatric nurse, and then, as you heard, I did general nursing after that in England before coming to Australia in the late 1980s. And interestingly, I'm still registered as a registered nurse. So if you look for me on the register, you will actually see me there. Whereas, interestingly, a lot of nurses, when they move out of clinical positions, actually give up their nursing registrations. But for me, it's a great badge of honour to be able to actually rely on the fact that I still have my nursing registration. And when I actually walk around the wards, and in particular, I should add, when I walk into mental health, I actually feel like I have much greater credibility because I have actually maintained my own registration. And of course, it's about our influence, and it's about our the changes that we can bring about as a result of our roles. It's not all about, as you would understand, it's not actually about doing clinical work. So in terms of the strong leadership moving forward, I'm really talking about us and what our opportunities are collectively to really shape the policy direction, I think, in healthcare, and for nurses to actually have a much greater and significant voice. Undoubtedly, doctors do already have that, and they sort of enjoy that, that profile. And I think we have a great opportunity, and in particular through the Australian College of Nursing, to really, if you like, sell and promote the significance and the importance of nursing within their community, but also within the hearts and minds of our providers. And I'm talking about from a funding provider perspective. So what is a leader? And of course you will have heard so many definitions of leaders, and if you had been a commentator or if you had been observing Australian politics, you might have thought, oh, they're people that generally come and go. And in some cases, they're people that bounce right on top of someone else. And that's exactly what we see, and we have seen, regrettably, in Australian politics. And I think there is a tiring right across the nation of the state of the politics in Australia. But I should add that in my own observations, I have actually seen that tide turn just ever so slightly in the past few weeks, since Malcolm Turnbull did indeed bounce right on top of Tony Abbott. But at the same time, I think the definition of a leader remains true, regardless of the fact that in some cases these were short periods of leadership, as in formal leadership roles. And I think that's the other very, very important point. When we're talking about leadership, there are people who are in formal leadership roles in organisation. It doesn't necessarily mean, though, by nature, that they're actually promoting or living leadership, but they may be in a recognised leadership role. And so I think this is a really good definition of what we all want to achieve through our leaders within our respective organisations, and certainly, in my case, this is exactly the person that I want to be. But we all know equally, so not just reflecting now on the Australian politics, but we know that we have seen some great leaders who have really had an enduring, or left an enduring legacy of the work that they have done. Now, in some cases, I think most of these people have lots in common, and that is that they had a very, very clear vision, and they were in the main able to actually endear people to their vision and endear people to actually come along with them. I think probably the person who stands out as being maybe slightly different there would actually be Margaret Thatcher. And whilst in many, many ways, though, I should add that Margaret Thatcher was indeed considered to be one of the great leaders of all time. At the same time, she also polarised people. And that's a really important aspect, I think, of leadership, that just actually getting things done isn't in and of itself useful if you're burning everyone along the way. And I think we all have worked with leaders like that in our respective organisations. And I think it's important to note that you can actually be an effective leader without burning everyone to actually achieve that end point. Now, there are many, many well-regarded and highly known sort of academics right across the world. So some of you will be familiar with some of these people. So on the far left there, we have Tom Peters, and then we have Rosabeth Moss-Kanter, John Cotter and Jim Collins. And I think at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter which one you sort of want to align your own views of the world with, or maybe use as your own reference point. I think it's a little bit like dieting, and you know, sort of, I've actually tried a number of diets, I should add myself, over the years, and some of those I should add at different times have been extremely successful. But my point is that, you know, the thing about dieting is that you actually have to eat less, you have to drink more, and you have to exercise. But they can be packaged in so many different ways. And I think the basic, sort of at the heart of leadership, it's exactly the same. But the models are actually explained differently. And I guess the one that I have really taken to is indeed the work of Jim Collins. Now, Jim Collins, the reason that I've become particularly interested in the work of Jim Collins is, first of all, it's something that I find very easy on a personal level to actually relate to. And I just want to ask, sort of, have many of you read Good to Great? Few people. Can I say to you, it is for me the most inspiring book I have ever read. I read it and so many different parts of what he was talking about resonated, and so much of what he'd written about has also ultimately helped me in my own style and in some of my own leadership challenges. And he essentially talks about disciplined people with disciplined thoughts and disciplined action. And of course, as you would understand, that all sounds very simple, and there is so much that actually sits under that. But there's a very strong evidence base for the work of Jim Collins. And he actually had over 20 research assistants working with him over a 5-year period. And this is a US book, and they looked at about 1,400 Fortune 500 companies. And they looked at what made good organisations great. So his number one principle is that good is the enemy of great. And if you only ever want to be good, then you will never be great. But if you want to be great, what are those factors that have actually made organisations successful? And what are those particular factors associated with leadership which actually gives those companies an enduring advantage, a competitive advantage over a longer period of time? And so he's defined what he calls level 5 leadership. And level 5 leadership is that paradoxical blend, if you like, of personal humility, as you can see there in terms of the definition, and a determined and a very professional will. So it is actually about getting people on board and bringing them along with you, but it is also about that personal humility. And I think this is really helpful in understanding that not all leaders are the same, of course, but what he has identified through this level 5 leadership in particular is that paradoxical blend of the professional will and also the humility, which has made the leaders of these companies much more successful. At the end of the day, though, Jim Collins is American and this is US research. And in some cases, that then becomes sort of a talking point in and of itself and detracts, if you like, from the main game of actually talking about leadership, which I'll come to then in a moment, some Australian research. But the other point I just want to very quickly make, and this is my reminder to talk to you about what Jim Collins talks about, which is the importance of getting the right people on the bus the right people off the bus, and then getting the right people in the right seats. And you know what? That really resonates with me, because in the perfect world, in our organisation, we would say that we have not got anyone that we want to get off the bus. But at the moment, I believe that we still have some people that we need to get off the bus. And in some cases, the passage of time, it really sort of creates for us a different challenge. But can I say to you that I think that is at the heart of actually improving organisations, is to get the wrong people unashamedly actually off the bus, because they're not helping us achieve our vision. And then taking his research, there is local evidence based on the first 11. So this is Australian research compiled by largely academics at Melbourne University, and they identified a number of factors, again, associated with successful organisations. And what they said about the leadership component is that it is more about the leadership and the art of leadership at all levels in the organisation that is going to make an organisation successful. So the more people that are actually leading in the organisation and living leadership, not necessarily in formal leadership positions, that is what is actually going to help make a most successful organisation, as opposed to the individual leader. Although, of course, one would argue if you had the right leaders, then you would also have that leadership also being lived at every level within the organisation. So that's, if you like, from an academic perspective, but then there are so many examples right around the world of where things have actually gone wrong. And with the, if you like, the advantage of hindsight, we have been able to actually learn so much. And of course, it is only with hindsight that we can actually have some of these learnings. I'm originally from Staffordshire myself, and I trained in southeast Staffordshire. And so I've taken a very, very close interest in what has been happening at Mid-Staffs over the last few years. And my parents, used to send me endless, newspaper cuttings, sort of saying, "Oh, Alan, I wish you were here sorting out Stafford Hospital," with that very fantastic Birmingham accent, which I've been working on. So, and it's interesting that what happened at Mid-Staffs, after that, the NHS actually asked our international quality guru again to actually undertake a review of what had actually happened at Mid-Staffs. And what he found in undertaking that review was, in fact, that Mid-Staffs would never have occurred if we'd taken on board the lessons of the Bristol Royal Infirmary. So what Don Berwick was actually saying in that is, if we could learn, and really did learn from the past, we should be able to prevent these things actually happening in the future. But it's not just in Mid-Staffs, it's not just in the Bristol Royal Infirmary. Of course, we've also had our own challenges over the years, both in New South Wales and also in Western Australia. And I think we should also learn from that as part of the leadership picture, because they are considered to be attributed to the most significant failings in healthcare right now across the world. So a little bit about Mid-Staffs. Mid-Staffs is right there in the middle of England. It comprised two hospitals, Stafford Hospital and also Cannock Hospital. This was actually very much focused, though, on Stafford Hospital as part of the Mid-Staffs. And I think we all ask the question, could Mid-Staffs happen within our own health service? And last year I presented to the Eastern Health Board on could Mid-Staffs happen at Eastern Health. So what is a Mid-Staffs and what happened there? Because I'm sure that most of you have heard about Mid-Staffs, and it's a really, really sad case, a real significantly failing case of leadership and culture that ultimately led to unnecessary deaths. In between 400 and 1,200 patients died between 2005 and 2008. So we're not talking about something here that happened 50 years ago. We are talking about something that happened within the last 10 years. And who would have thought that something like this could happen? And there, but for the grace of God, possibly go all of us. And who knows what will be happening today and next week across the rest of the world. But we certainly hope that this won't be happening to us. So, interestingly, I've made a few visits also, professional visits, that is, to Stafford Hospital in the post-period, to actually talk to people, to truly learn and understand what are the lessons that can actually be transferred. And I also had the opportunity to meet Julie Hendry at a conference. And so she was the director there of patient experience, and her first point was about weak leadership. and leaders being inaccessible and not being seen within the organisation. So again, a really important point, I think, and lots of learnings there for us, which I think we can all make relative to our own health services. And then Robert Francis QC, who ultimately he completed 3 reviews, including public hearings into mid-staffs. There are 1 million pages worth of documentation. As you saw before, there are about 1.6 million hits currently on Google when you put in mid-staff scandal, 250 witnesses and hearings that cost more than £10 million, or nowadays just over $20 million. And what he talks about is heeding the warning signs, and there are a list of things that I think we can all relate to, and there, but for the grace of God, to a certain extent, go all of us. So how can we assure ourselves and our organisations and our boards that this is not actually going to happen within our own organisation? And what you can see there also is passive challenging from the board. So the board really wasn't taking on its responsibilities very seriously and wasn't asking those very targeted questions. And the other particular note of interest for me is that the word hindsight, he said, was mentioned in so many reports. And the point there being that if we could sort of put the hindsight to one side, really focus on the way forward, then perhaps we could do something to actually prevent mid-staffs rather than write about it in hindsight once again. And now, of course, across the world, and certainly within Victoria, we are really changing our focus. So meetings, performance meetings, for example, that I would attend with our Department of Health and Human Services, they would actually be focusing on, Alan, how is access going? What's the financial position? What is the WEAS, which is the case mix funding which we previously had in Victoria? And whilst I was always very interested, I should add, in all of those things, in my heart I was also disappointed that they weren't really interested in things that I think are much more significant, and in particular, I should add, the culture of the organisation, which I actually place at the top of any list. Nothing else really matters if we don't actually have the right culture, and that's really about living the values of our organisations. So our focus now in Victoria has really shifted. Our high-performing health service framework looks at leadership, governance, culture. We have a monthly score of each of our health services in Victoria, and we're all ranked with each other. That's not publicly available data, but it certainly motivates all health services to make sure we're doing the right things. And interestingly, there's a great publication that I would highly recommend to you called Exploring the Care Quality Commission's Well-Led Domain, which if you like, within NHS or within English parlance, within the health service parlance, this is really one of their dimensions of their accreditation system. Now that's undertaken by the Care Quality Commission, and they actually have a domain that is called the Well-Led Domain. So their assessors are specifically looking at aspects attributed to creating positive workplace cultures. So what we've done now within Eastern Health is we've taken, and I have poured over pages and pages of what's come out of mid-staffs. We have taken the examining the CQC's domain, and what we have now developed for Eastern Health is what we are referring to as our culture scorecard. It's very new at the moment. It's something that we've really just started working on in the last few months, and was an outcome, and it was a personal challenge of mine after my presentation to the board last year on mid-staffs. And what I really wanted to bring out of this is, well, what can we learn so that we're not writing about things in hindsight, but how can we prospectively monitor what is happening? So what I've done basically through pouring through all of the pages and pages of the report, looking at what happens in a well-performing organisation. I mean, you could go on forever, but I've chosen what I consider to be the 20 most relevant key performance indicators, which would at least be lead indicators or high-level flags to allow us to look further. So we will only know the benefit of this over time, and the red flag there was just a reminder to us that whilst we have a fantastic patient experience of care system within Eastern Health, our board directors did not all read our quarterly patient experience of care report because that went through the board quality committee, but that is now being undertaken, so that will be green next time round. So when I bring all of this information together, my observations of what the academics are actually talking about, what we've actually seen happening in practice, both in Australia and also overseas, and based on my own experience, I have really come to the conclusion that at the heart of successful leadership is what I'm calling the P3 trilogy, which is that simultaneous focus on patients, on people and also on performance. And for me, I can actually organise everything that I do within that particular framework, and I find it a really useful framework in terms of helping me keep focused, if you like, and some balance on all of the things that I actually have to do in my workplace leadership role. And so I guess I leave with you almost a 10-point self-assessment checklist with respect to leadership, and a number of questions I think that you can ask of yourselves and also of your teams. But this is really my own sort of top 10 based on what I've read, based on what I've practiced, and also based on what I have actually observed in other successful organisations. And I think that if you can answer positively, essentially, in the affirmative to all of these questions, then I think you can also feel comfortable that we're on a shared journey around the significance and the importance of a positive workplace leadership environment, which creates, in turn, a very positive focus on the culture. So one of them I'll just pick out there, for example, is do you, number 8, you know, sort of how well do you serve those that serve you? And for me, this is a key indicator. So how quickly I am responded to and how quickly I respond to others, for me, is really important, because if I don't respond to others quickly, how can I expect other people to do that? And if people don't respond to me quickly, well, my assumption is that they're not responding to others quickly as well. And so for me, that's really one of in the hierarchy, that's one of the higher order questions. And the other thing is, how much do you give of yourself? So Janice Secatore, again, back at the Alfred, said to me, Alan, always remember that the needs of the individual come third, the needs of the group come second, and the needs of the organisation actually come first. And I think sometimes some people actually forget that it's the needs of the organisation that come first, not the needs of the individual. And I think that's a really important sort of understanding in terms of, do you actually give of yourself? And so to be an effective leader, I think we all need to be able to give feedback and also to receive feedback. I think that is just so important, and sometimes you open yourselves up for feedback and you don't always hear what you think you are going to hear. But my response to that is, if you actually assume, or you have a starting point that you haven't actually achieved or reached perfection, then it's actually good to get some feedback on an area that you actually need to improve on, and never, of course, to give up. And I think also, as well as the leadership aspect to everything that we do, there are some technical aspects that I think will make for successful leaders in healthcare and will help nurses be more successful. And so we do actually have to be strong on finance, operations and strategy, quality and strategy. These are things which actually are very important. And I have to say, I am surprised and sometimes disappointed at the calibre of written work, in particular in nursing. And I'm the current honorary chair of the Apostrophe Preservation Society of Victoria. Thank you. Please follow me on Twitter. But really, you know, sort of, I find it such a huge distraction. So once I've got over my distraction, I can get on with the quality of the work. But I think as nurses, we should unashamedly address the fact that we do have to be able to write, and we have to be able to write properly if we're able to express a view, or we want to express a view and actually have that view heard and considered in the same way that others would actually have theirs considered. And I have to say, I'm taking some heart at the moment that my eldest daughter is currently a second-year student, and I'm really, a nursing student that is, and I'd have to say I'm really chuffed that she actually shares with me sometimes areas where the students are actually getting pulled up on their written work. So I think that's a real welcome shift. And the other thing too is that I think we need to keep nurses nursing, and you know, looking out there for the occupational terrorists, as I like to fondly refer to them, but they have really started to take over work. So I'd have to say, you know, how have nurses, you know, who are often involved with bathing and assisting patients in ADLs, how is it that we're not qualified to actually therefore undertake the shower assessment, because the OT has to come and do that? And we're feeding patients and clients and residents all of the time, but not qualified to actually do the swallowing assessment, because that's what we need the speech pathologist to do. And I know we can all sit here and sort of laugh at that, but to me, it is actually a tangible expression of how sometimes I think we have actually lost our way, and we actually need to reclaim that as nursing work, and proudly so. And I think that's a really, really important point. Excellent. So just a couple of quotes now to conclude, and I think this is really some salient points about leadership, and I think it is sometimes, it's not necessarily about what you have said that people will ultimately remember, but they will remember the way you have actually made them feel. And I can think of many examples, you know, sort of where people have, I can't remember the detail of what they said, but I can remember they either made me feel better or worse about a particular situation. And it's the little things that matter most, and that is about the courtesy of saying hello to people, saying hello to colleagues. And, you know, again, these things are really important, and we need not to accept that we should have a decline in standards around our interpersonal communications with each other. Which brings me nicely then to the next quote, which was from a famous now International Women's Day speech given by David Morrison. And I just think that is a fantastic quote to almost conclude that the standard you walk past is the standard you accept. And so if you walk past something today that you don't think is good enough, you have actually condoned it. And that's a great reminder to get back to people at work when you're not happy about something that perhaps you've observed. And of course, there's also a right time which needs to be considered as part of that. And so in summary, a quote again from Robert Francis, who'd undertaken a number of reviews into mid-staffs, that leadership really at the end of the day is the key to changing the culture in an organisation. And at the end of the day, leadership and culture unequivocally actually do go hand in hand. And so I think that's a great point to end on. But finally, we are all in charge of our own destinations, and I hope that you will continue to do your great work in nursing, and I hope that through our conversation, through this presentation today, through being here at the ACN conference, that we can actually collectively advance nursing and take it to an even better place. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, Alan Lilly, Chief Executive Officer, Eastern Health. Thank you, Alan. We appreciate that. We've allowed a couple of minutes for questions, and of course Pigeonhole has been going hot. So we'll start with the top question and we'll work our way back, allowing for time. How do you get the wrong people off the bus and the right people driving the bus?
Yeah, okay. So it's a very good question, but I guess what I would say to you is that I think it would be an unusual organisation that does not have the proper processes in place to actually get people off the bus. But I do recognise that it is very, very hard work. But at the end of the day, what I would say in our organisation is that we have no shortage of policies and procedures to help us get people off the bus through performance management processes, and sometimes they can be long and tedious. But I can tell you now, as an employer, there is no one in our organisation that we need to have if we don't think we should actually have them. But what I would say to you, as opposed to there is no shortage of policies and procedures, there is a shortage of people who are actually prepared, and managers I'm now referring to, managers who are actually prepared to follow it through. And it takes a lot of effort and takes a lot of focus. And my advice to all of our managers, in particular where they are coming into challenging areas, is it's a little bit like Noah's Ark, you know, sort of usually it's 2 by 2. So don't try and tackle everyone's issues all at the same time. Just try and deal with a couple of issues and then move on. But I guess what I would say to you, it actually comes back to the will, because there is definitely a way.
Okay, fantastic. We have another dozen people out there that would like to know what unique capabilities do nurse leaders bring to the executive table?
Yeah, I think it's that sort of unique sort of role that we have played in healthcare. We will all in our careers have actually undertaken clinical work, so we know what patients look like, feel like, etc. And I think what's really, really important is that we understand how care processes actually work. And I can remember in my Director of Access role back at the Alfred again in the late 1990s, and it was really when it struck me about how unique my background was in actually understanding how the wards work, how an emergency department works, how outpatients works, because lots of people in other disciplines are not exposed to that breadth of experience, I think, that we as nurses, and in particular I should add, those nurses who have trained in the hospital system. I think we had a unique exposure which really makes us at the board table and at the executive table very able to offer an informed view or perspective in a much different way to maybe a CFO.
Finally then, we've got one more minute. I'll squeeze one more in. It's got here, nursing in Queensland suffered in recent years quite a lot. How do you think that people can positively recover from the experiences of the last few years?
Yeah, so I think sort of my general advice would be to look at the past and recognise what was wrong and how we could actually improve that moving forward, and almost then put that to one side and actually focus on the future, because if you're actually constantly caught up with what has happened before, it's very hard to move forward. But I think you always need to, in any change process, you do need to acknowledge the past, but then you also need to unequivocally say it's now time for us to actually start moving forward. And we can't constantly be held back by the lone voice here and there. We actually, again, it comes back to the needs of the individual, a third, the needs of the group are second, and the needs of the organisation, in this case Queensland, actually come first. And if we're constantly caught up in the past, we're never going to be able to address Queensland's nursing needs moving forward.
Ladies and gentlemen, Alan, Lilly, thank you, Alan.
Thank you very much.